Marriage is a beautiful, precious thing, and it's meant to be exclusive between a man and a woman and not to be encroached on by anybody. And so God does not want the marriage covenant, the marriage relationship to be violated. He does not want it to be disrupted. And so he puts things in place in order to protect it. In the last video, we talked about the creation of marriage. God created marriage, and he created it for his own glory, and he created it for the benefit of his human image bearers. But he also created it to display something wonderful about his relationship with his people. And the marriage is to reflect Christ's relationship with his church. Marriage is meant to be exclusive. It's meant to be intimate. It's meant to be just between one woman and one man until death do them part. And so God put things in place in Israel when he revealed himself to the nation of Israel. He put things in place to protect marriage. See, marriage is a beautiful, precious thing, and it's meant to be exclusive between a man and a woman and not to be encroached on by anybody. And so God does not want the marriage covenant, the marriage relationship to be violated. He does not want it to be disrupted. And so he puts things in place in order to protect it. So we need to think about the protection of marriage. God puts protections in place in order to guard the preciousness of marriage. Remember, marriage is to redound to God's glory, but it's also for our benefit. It's for our benefit that marriage be protected. One of the deepest betrayals is that betrayal that happens in adultery, when a man cheats on his wife or a wife cheats on her husband. And so God at the beginning said in the commandments that he gave to Israel, one of the most important commandments was that they were to not ever commit adultery. And adultery is committing sexual intercourse with someone who's not your wife or not your husband, not your spouse. And this is kind of the arch betrayal, you could say, because you can't be intimate with anybody like you can be intimate with your spouse. God has created man and woman to be intimate in a way that only man and woman can be intimate, and only in a way that should happen in marriage. That's the way God intended it. And when that intimacy is shared with someone other than your spouse rightly feels betrayed. It is really the arch betrayal. In fact, God uses adultery as the illustration of how Israel and his people committed adultery against him and worshiped other gods. It was the arch betrayal. Why would you leave intimacy with the one true God in order to pursue idols? It's like a man committing adultery against his wife, or a wife committing adultery against her husband. So God tells Israel, you shall not commit adultery. But it's not just on the level of physical intercourse. It's also, you should not covet your neighbor's wife, as he says later on in Exodus chapter 20. You not only are to not commit adultery, but you're not to covet your neighbor's wife. You're not to look at your neighbor's wife and go, I would rather have her than my wife. That is sinful, and that's a sin of the heart that needs to be repented of. But that is a protection of marriage, because that is guarding that man or that woman. She can be guilty of the same thing. It's guarding them from allowing sinful thoughts to grow into the actual act of that betrayal of sexual intimacy with someone other than their spouse. And so God says, even at the heart level, you have to be careful not to entertain thoughts that would betray your spouse. And Jesus reiterates this actually in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus isn't making up anything new when he says that when you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you are committing adultery. This is a reflection of what had been taught in Exodus 20 when it said, don't covet your neighbor's wife. Jesus is simply pointing out that adultery begins in the heart. So you can't simply think that, well, I've never committed physical adultery, therefore I am pure. No, if you've ever lusted after a woman other than your wife, or if you ever lusted after a man who's not your husband, then you've committed adultery where? In your heart. And so again, Jesus is reaffirming this protection of marriage that we see in Exodus and in God's revelation to Israel. Because marriage is so precious and so wonderful, and because it was designed to be exclusive between a man and a woman, Jesus has strong words, and the book of Exodus has strong words about marriage and the protection of it. Marriage is considered a covenant between a man and a woman, much like the covenants that God made with Israel. It's an agreement. An agreement between a man and a woman to be faithful to one another. And it's something that is quite special, like we've already mentioned, because it's the kind of covenant that is sealed through an intimacy that can only be shared between a man and a woman, and should only be shared between a husband and a wife. And in the best of all possible scenarios, a man and a woman will have kept themselves pure from intercourse before they consummate their covenant relationship with one another on their wedding night. And so marriage is meant to be seen as a covenant, which is an agreement between the husband and the wife to love each other exclusively until death do them part, and to remain faithful to them until death do them part. And so we need to recognize that marriage is permanent. Marriage was always intended to be permanent. When God created Adam and Eve, He intended for Adam and Eve to remain married until one of them died. And when Israel was hardening their hearts, and the men in Israel were hardening their hearts towards their wives, God allowed them to divorce their wives. But this was never God's intention, as Jesus makes clear in the New Testament. It was not as though it was a fine thing and a good thing that the men were divorcing their wives. It was just allowed in order to keep some measure of peace in Israel. But Jesus tells us in Matthew 19 that it was never intended to be this way. In fact, divorce shouldn't be an option among people. In fact, the breaking of that covenant is something that's grievous and not something that should be pursued. And so there is a permanence to marriage. Now, of course, there are situations where a divorce must occur. In fact, we're given situations in the New Testament where divorce is allowed, and one of those is if there's been adultery in the relationship. But overall, marriage should be seen as permanent. Marriage should also be seen as sacred. Why? Because it reflects Christ's relationship with His church, because it reflects God's relationship with His people, because it is an intimate relationship between a man and a woman. It's a sacred thing. It's a beautiful thing, and it should be protected, and that's why God protects it. It's an intimate relationship. A man and a woman can be intimate with one another like no other people can be intimate with one another. Men and men, they have a friendship with one another. Women with women have a friendship with one another, but they can never have intimacy with one another. That is only reserved for a husband and wife and a man and a woman. And intimacy bleeds over into every area of the relationship. It's not just physical, it's emotional, it's spiritual. You begin to even think each other's thoughts after them. You get to know them in ways that you just don't know other people. You know what makes them tick. You know what they love. You know what they hate. You know the words that they're going to say even before they say them. There's an intimacy in marriage that God intends, and it's a beautiful thing. There's a mutuality in marriage as well. Both the husband and the wife work for each other's good and benefit, and they love to do so, and that's the ideal in the marriage. And then finally, we've already mentioned it, there's exclusiveness in marriage. And an excellent book on these topics is actually Andreas Kostenberger's book, God, Marriage, and Family. And that's where I've gotten some of these points about the nature of the marriage covenant. But we land finally on the exclusiveness of marriage. In fact, one author has said that the essence of marriage is its exclusivity. That's what marriage is. It's exclusive. You cannot share that love that you have for your wife or that love that you have with your husband with anyone else. You're never intended to, which is why it's wrong for men and women to treat other people other than their spouses in special ways, in ways that are only fitting for a man to share with his wife or a wife with her husband, because there is an exclusivity there that's appropriate. There is a kind of jealousy that is a good and wholesome jealousy, that when a husband sees his wife flirting with another man or a woman sees her husband flirting with another woman, there's a right amount of jealousy that flares up in the heart. And this is good. It's like the jealousy that God had for His people. He was jealous for their affection. He wanted them to only worship Him and not worship idols. And that's appropriate and wholesome. And similarly, in a marriage, it is right for the husband to want his wife's exclusive affection for him, and for no other man to love another man the same way she loves him. Of course, she will love the men in her life like her dad and her brother and cousins and so on, but it won't be anything like the love that she has for her husband. And same for the husband and his wife. He will have an exclusive love for her, and he won't be someone who flirts and leads other women on. All that flirting and all that kind of affection will be reserved for his wife. Why? Because marriage is meant to be exclusive, ultimately because it is meant to reflect Christ and his church. And so God has put many things in place to protect marriage. We should be thankful that he did. He didn't do this to keep us from enjoying something. He actually put all these protections in place so that we will enjoy his gift to the highest possible degree. And you can talk to many men and women who have sought to preserve their marriage relationship and to be careful in protecting their friendship with their spouse, who have saved themselves sexually until marriage, and they can attest that those things that they put in place have given them such joy in their relationship that they wouldn't trade it for the world. And they are thankful that God has put in place these protections. God is protecting something precious, not prohibiting something that would bring pleasure to us. And we have to remember this. God is wise, and he does truly care for us, and he wants what is best for us. And so he's laid out these protections for marriage. In another coming video, we will talk about the blessings of marriage, and we'll see you then.